Ava Mitchell, a brilliant and compassionate surgeon, steps out of a cafe after a long day, ready to head home. But within minutes, her ordinary afternoon turns into something else entirely, a public confrontation that leaves her humiliated, handcuffed, and surrounded by silent onlookers. The reason? A vague description and assumptions that carry more weight than they should. But Ava is no ordinary woman. She is not only a respected doctor, but also the wife of Daniel Mitchell, Havenbrook's police commissioner, a man known for his unwavering commitment to justice. When Daniel arrives, the scene explodes into something far larger than any of them expected, setting off a chain of events that will shake the city. In the days that follow, Ava must decide whether to stay quiet or stand tall against injustice, not just for herself, but for those who have been silenced for far too long. As the truth unfolds, allies emerge. Unexpected kindness changes the course of fate, and the entire city is forced to examine its heart. But even as hope grows, Ava and Daniel must face a system reluctant to change and a community divided. This story is more than a fight for justice. It is a story of resilience, courage, and the quiet strength that transforms ordinary people into symbols of change. The winter air was crisp as Ava Mitchell stepped out of Havenbrook Cafe, the familiar warmth of her favorite latte still lingering in her hands. The street was calm, the soft hum of passing cars blending with the occasional chatter of pedestrians. Ava tugged her gray coat tighter around her as she adjusted her scarf and glanced at the small gift box in her other hand, a thank-you gift for a nurse who had helped her through a difficult surgery that morning. Ava had always believed in the power of small gestures. Despite her long hours as a surgeon at Havenbrook General, she made time for moments like this, visiting her favorite cafe, greeting the barista by name, and savoring 10 minutes of stillness before returning to the chaos of the hospital. She relished the simplicity of these rituals, grounding herself amid the demands of her career. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. She wanted to enjoy the quiet for a few more minutes. As she reached her car parked across the street, she paused to search for her keys. Just then, a patrol car slowed to a stop beside her, the flash of red and blue lights catching her off guard. 2 officers stepped out. The taller of the two, Brad Turner, adjusted his hat and approached Ava with an air of authority. His partner, Eric Lawson, followed a few steps behind, his eyes wary but passive. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken as they closed the distance. "Ma'am, may I see your ID?" Brad's tone was clipped. Ava blinked, surprised. "Is something wrong, officer?" Brad crossed his arms. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. You match the description." Ava stared at him, confused. "Suspicious activity? I just left the cafe?" She motioned toward the storefront with its familiar red brick walls and large windows. Brad's eyes hardened. "Identification, please." Ava took a steadying breath, reminding herself to stay calm. She reached for her wallet, trying to make sense of the situation. She handed over her ID, watching as Brad inspected it with a slow, deliberate scrutiny. Eric shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Ava noticed the quiet tension between the 2 officers. Bystanders began to slow down, watching from a distance. Ava's cheeks flushed as she felt their stares. Brad handed her ID back. "We need to conduct a search." Ava's stomach sank. "A search? On what grounds?" "You match the description," Brad repeated, his tone sharp. Ava's instinct for fairness rose to the surface. "Officer, I respect your work, but I know my rights. If there is no evidence, this must be a misunderstanding." Brad's expression darkened. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" Ava's heart pounded. She met his gaze steadily. "No, I am not refusing. I just want to understand why." The street fell silent, the hum of passing cars fading into the background. Then, in one swift motion, Brad reached for his handcuffs. The cold metal snapped around her wrists, before she could process what was happening. A wave of disbelief and humiliation washed over Ava. The weight of the cuffs pressed down on her, not just physically, but emotionally. She glanced at the onlookers, some hurried past, unwilling to get involved, while others took out their phones, recording in silence. Brad's voice cut through the cold air. "Turn around!" Ava stood frozen, her mind racing. She felt the world tilt as her sense of control slipped away. But before she could respond, a firm voice rang out. "What is the meaning of this?" The crowd parted as an elderly woman with silver hair and a determined gait approached. Martha Reed, a retired teacher known in Havenbrook for her outspokenness, stopped in front of the officers, her sharp gaze fixed on Brad. "Why are you handcuffing her?" Martha demanded. "What did she do?" Brad's jaw tightened. "This is a police matter, ma'am." Martha crossed her arms. "And this is my city. I have lived here for 65 years. I have seen plenty, and I know injustice when I see it." She pointed at Ava, her voice rising with indignation. "You have no right to treat her like this." Ava's eyes stung with gratitude as she looked at Martha. The elderly woman's courage filled the space like a beacon of hope. Brad shifted, but did not back down. "I suggest you step back, ma'am." Martha did not flinch. "Or what? You will arrest me too?" She stepped closer. "What you are doing is wrong, and you know it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. More phones were raised as people began filming. Brad's confidence flickered, but his grip on the situation tightened in defiance. Ava took a steadying breath, drawing strength from Martha's bravery. "May I make a phone call?" she asked, her voice calm despite the turmoil in her chest. Brad hesitated for a long moment before nodding. "Make it quick." With difficulty, Ava pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Ava?" "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I need you." There was a pause, and then his voice, low and steady, filled her ear. "Where are you?" "The corner of Main and Willow," she replied. They stopped me." "I am on my way," Daniel said, each word resolute and unshakable. Ava exhaled, relief mixing with fear. She ended the call and met Martha's gaze. The retired teacher nodded as if to say, "You are not alone." Minutes passed like hours. The tension in the air was thick as the sound of murmuring grew louder. Then, from a distance, the familiar rumble of an engine pierced the silence. Ava's heart lifted as a black SUV turned onto the street, its sleek frame gleaming under the winter sun. The SUV came to a stop with a soft screech. The door opened, and Daniel Mitchell stepped out. The world seemed to pause as the police commissioner of Havenbrook City surveyed the scene before him, his wife standing in handcuffs, the crowd gathered, and the officers frozen in place. His gaze locked on Ava, and his face hardened. He walked toward her, his every step deliberate and unwavering. The crowd hushed as Daniel reached Ava, gently taking her hands and unlocking the cuffs with practiced ease. The clink of the metal as it hit the ground echoed in the still air. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her. Ava nodded, though tears threatened to fall. "I am now." Daniel straightened, turning to face Brad and Eric. His expression was calm, but unyielding. "Explain yourselves," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. The street held its breath as justice arrived. Daniel Mitchell's sharp gaze bore into Officer Brad Turner, who stood rigid yet visibly shaken. The quiet that had settled over the street was heavy with anticipation, as though everyone around was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Brad cleared his throat and tried to regain his composure. "Sir, we were responding to a report of suspicious activity in the area." Daniel held up a hand, silencing him with a look. "You handcuffed my wife in the middle of the street, in front of witnesses, with no clear evidence." His voice was calm, but there was a current of barely contained fury beneath it. What exactly made you think that was necessary? Ava stood beside Daniel, the red marks from the handcuffs still visible on her wrists. She hadn't moved, but she felt an unfamiliar sense of safety now that Daniel was here. Martha Reed stayed close, her eyes darting between Daniel and the officers. Brad shifted on his feet, but before he could speak again, Daniel took a step forward. "I need specifics, Officer Turner. You claim there was a report. What was the description you were acting on?" Brad's confidence faltered. "The report said, a woman in a dark coat near this intersection. We thought she might—" He trailed off, aware of how flimsy it sounded out loud. Daniel's expression hardened. "A vague description that could apply to dozens of people on this street. Did she resist you? Did she act aggressively? Did she run?" Brad lowered his eyes. "No, sir." "Then why the handcuffs?" Daniel's tone grew colder with each word. "You humiliated an innocent woman without cause. Or is it simply because she happens to be a woman of color, standing in a part of town where you think she doesn't belong?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. More phones were raised, the scene being recorded from multiple angles now. Officer Eric Lawson, who had been silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. We were just following procedure," he muttered, though his voice was tinged with doubt. Daniel's gaze snapped to him. "Is that what you think your duty is? To violate someone's dignity and claim procedure as a shield?" Ava's heart swelled with a mix of emotions, gratitude, anger, and a strange, fragile hope. She had known Daniel was fierce when it came to justice, but seeing him now, standing in front of the crowd, unyielding in defense of what was right, filled her with awe. Martha stepped forward again, unafraid. They had no reason to stop her. She addressed the growing crowd. She wasn't hurting anyone. She wasn't doing anything suspicious. Her voice grew louder. "This isn't about procedure. It's about prejudice." The crowd shifted, uneasy but emboldened by her words. Brad's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "We didn't know she was your wife," he said defensively. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And that is exactly the problem." He took another step forward, the space between them shrinking. "If she weren't my wife, would you have treated her with more respect? Or would you have continued assuming she was guilty of something she never did?" Ava reached for Daniel's arm, gently pulling him back. "Daniel," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm okay." She didn't want things to spiral further. Daniel's features softened as he looked at her, but only for a moment. He turned back to the officers. "Internal Affairs will be here shortly," he informed them. "I suggest you prepare yourselves to answer for this." As if on cue, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 black sedans pulled up, and 3 officers in black uniforms stepped out, members of the Internal Affairs Division. Their serious expressions made it clear that this was no routine visit. Brad and Eric's postures stiffened as one of the Internal Affairs officers approached. Daniel didn't need to explain. The scene spoke for itself. The handcuffs on the ground, Ava's shaken composure, the gathered crowd. The lead officer addressed Brad and Eric. "We've received reports about this incident. You'll need to come with us for questioning." Brad hesitated, but then nodded stiffly. He and Eric began walking toward the sedan, their earlier arrogance replaced with quiet dread. The Internal Affairs officers guided them away as the crowd slowly began to disperse, though many lingered, whispering about what they had witnessed. Daniel exhaled slowly and turned to Ava. "Let's go home," he said softly, taking her hand. Martha stepped closer, her expression warm. "You're strong, Ava, stronger than you know." She smiled, a reassuring glint in her eyes. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." Ava squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Martha. I'll never forget what you did." Martha nodded and walked away, her silver hair catching the light as she moved through the parting crowd. As Daniel led Ava to their SUV, The tension in her chest began to ease. She took a slow breath and allowed herself to feel safe again. Inside the car, the silence between them was heavy but comforting. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel was tight as they pulled away from the scene. "I am so sorry you went through that," he said, after a long pause. His voice was thick with emotion. Ava turned to him. "It wasn't your fault, Daniel." "But it is my responsibility," he said, his jaw clenched. "This is the system I am supposed to lead, and today it failed you." Ava reached for his hand, resting hers gently on top of his. "What matters is how we move forward." She hesitated before adding, "I want to speak out." Daniel glanced at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" Ava nodded. "If I stay silent, this will happen to someone else. Someone who might not have a Martha or a Daniel to stand with them." Daniel's expression softened with pride and concern. "Then we will do this together." The SUV turned onto their street, where familiar trees swayed gently in the wind. The warmth of their home waited at the end of the road, but they both knew that this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater as Ava settled onto the couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The soft lamplight bathed the room in warmth, but no amount of warmth could fully ease the lingering chill from the afternoon's events. Her wrists still bore the faint red marks where the handcuffs had pressed against her skin. Daniel walked in from the kitchen, a glass of water in his hand. He handed it to her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Drink this." Ava took a small sip and smiled at him, though it did not quite reach her eyes. She appreciated how Daniel hovered nearby, wanting to fix everything, but knowing he could not undo what had already happened. "They will pay for this," Daniel said quietly, sitting beside her. "I promise you that." Ava rested her head against his shoulder. "I know you will do everything you can, but I cannot stop thinking about all the people this happens to who do not have someone like you." She paused, closing her eyes. "What if Martha hadn't been there? What if I had been alone?" Daniel's arm tightened around her. "You are not alone. You never will be." But Ava's thoughts kept circling back to the humiliation, the way she had stood in the street while strangers recorded her fear and confusion. She had always believed in fairness and justice. She had built her life around helping others, but that belief had been shaken. Daniel's phone buzzed, pulling them both from their thoughts. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "Internal Affairs is already moving forward. The officers in charge want a meeting tomorrow to discuss how we will handle this publicly." Ava looked up at him. "They want you to manage the fallout." Daniel nodded grimly. "They want to control the narrative before it becomes something bigger." Ava straightened, something sparking in her eyes. "Then let it become something bigger." Daniel blinked at her, surprised by the firmness in her voice. Ava set the glass down on the coffee table and took his hand. "I am not the first person this has happened to, Daniel. And if we do nothing, I will not be the last. I do not just want an apology or a press release. I want change." Daniel studied her for a long moment. He saw the same quiet resolve that made her an exceptional surgeon, the same resilience that had pulled her through every challenge life had thrown at her. "You want to speak out," he said, more a statement than a question. Ava nodded. "Yes, I want people to know what happened. I want them to understand that this is not about my connections or your position. It is about dignity and respect." Daniel hesitated. He knew the risks. Speaking publicly would put Ava at the center of attention, and not all of it would be supportive. "There will be people who twist this, Ava. They will try to paint you as someone looking for attention or using me to make this bigger than it is." His voice softened. "Are you ready for that?" Ava's gaze did not waver. "I do not care what they say. This is not just about me. It is about standing up for everyone who has felt powerless and afraid. I owe it to them. We both do." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had always admired Ava's ability to see the bigger picture, but it was something else entirely to watch her take her pain and turn it into purpose. "Then we will do this together," he said. Ava's phone vibrated on the table. She reached for it, recognizing the name on the screen. It was Martha Reed. "Hi, Martha," Ava said, her voice softening. "Ava, dear, how are you holding up?" Martha's voice was warm but laced with concern. "I am all right," Ava replied. "Thanks to you." Martha huffed. "You do not need to thank me. What they did to you was wrong. I could not stand by and watch it happen." Ava's heart swelled. "You gave me the courage to keep my head up. You reminded me that there is still kindness in this world." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Well, I am glad if I could help. But Ava, you are stronger than you think. You did not need me. You just needed a reminder of who you are." Tears pricked the corners of Ava's eyes. "Thank you, Martha." "Any time, dear," Martha said. "And if you need someone to stand by you when you speak out, I will be there." Ava's breath caught. "You would do that?" "Of course," Martha said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "This fight is not yours alone." When the call ended, Ava sat quietly for a moment, absorbing Martha's words. Daniel reached for her hand again. "We will not be alone in this," he said. The next morning, the city of Havenbrook woke to news of the incident. Videos of the confrontation had spread online, drawing thousands of views and comments. Some people condemned the officers' actions, while others defended them. The public response was a storm of outrage, empathy, and division. The media caught wind of the story quickly. Ava's face was splashed across the local news, her name mentioned alongside terms like injustice and abuse of power. Daniel received calls from reporters and city officials, all wanting a statement. Inside their home, Ava watched the coverage with quiet determination. She knew that what came next would not be easy. There would be backlash. There would be those who tried to discredit her. But she also knew that there would be people who listened, people who had been waiting for someone to speak the truth. Daniel sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" Ava met his gaze and nodded. "I am." The phone rang again, and this time Ava answered. It was an invitation for a live interview. She hesitated for only a second before agreeing. This was her chance to tell her story in her own words, to remind the world that no one should be treated as less than human. As they prepared for the interview, Daniel placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. "You are the strongest person I know." Ava smiled at him, her heart full, despite the uncertainty ahead. "I learned from the best." The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Havenbrook Broadcasting Studio. The bright lights and hum of cameras being adjusted filled the room, but Ava sat still in her chair, calm despite the chaos around her. A production assistant clipped the microphone to her blouse, while a makeup artist dabbed concealer under her eyes to hide the fatigue that had settled in after the last 24 hours. Daniel stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching protectively. Though he trusted Ava's strength, he felt the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. He knew how brutal the public could be, and how easily the truth could be twisted. Ava caught his eye and smiled softly. "I will be okay," she reassured him. Daniel nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "Just tell your story, Ava. Nothing more, nothing less." The host, a polished man in a navy blue suit, approached and introduced himself. His demeanor was calm but curious, the way reporters often were before tackling a controversial topic. "We will be live in 2 minutes," he said with a practiced smile. Ava gave a small nod, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Despite the bustle, a strange quiet settled over her. She had spent years navigating life-or-death situations in the operating room. She had learned how to stay steady when chaos threatened to overwhelm her. This was no different. She was here not for herself, but for every person who had felt powerless and afraid. The countdown began. In 5, 4, 3. The red light blinked on, and the host faced the camera with a professional smile. Good morning, Havenbrook. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ava Mitchell, a respected surgeon at Havenbrook General Hospital and the wife of Police Commissioner Daniel Mitchell. She is here to share her experience regarding an incident that has captured the city's attention. The camera panned to Ava, who sat with quiet poise. The host's tone shifted slightly gentle, but probing. Dr. Mitchell, can you take us back to what happened that day? Ava took a slow breath. Of course. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events: the coffee shop, the officers approaching her, and the moment the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She spoke without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. When they placed the handcuffs on me, she said, her voice softening, I felt something I had never experienced before: powerlessness. I have spent my career helping others in their most vulnerable moments, and yet, in that moment, I was the one who felt helpless. The host nodded, leaning in slightly. Some people argue that the officers were just doing their jobs, that they were responding to a report of suspicious activity. Ava met his gaze head-on. Suspicious activity? She paused for effect, her voice calm but firm. I was standing by my car, carrying a coffee and a gift for a colleague. What made me suspicious? My coat? My presence in that part of town? Or was it simply the color of my skin? A silence settled over the room. Even the crew, who had seen dozens of interviews, stood still, listening intently. The host cleared his throat. There has been criticism from some who believe that because of your position as the commissioner's wife, this incident has gained more attention than it might have otherwise. What do you say to that? Ava nodded thoughtfully, as if she had anticipated the question. They are right. My story is getting attention because of who my husband is. But that is exactly why I am here. I do not want this to be just about me. This is about every person who has faced similar injustice and has been ignored. If I stay silent, I am complicit. If I use my voice, maybe someone else will not have to suffer the same humiliation. The host's expression softened. What do you hope will come from this? Ava's gaze drifted slightly, as though she was picturing something far beyond the room. Change, she said simply. I want change, not just policies on paper, but real accountability and transparency. Everyone deserves to feel safe, no matter who they are or where they come from. The host gave a small nod of respect. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for your bravery and honesty. He turned to the camera. When we return, we will discuss the broader implications of this incident and the ongoing response from the Havenbrook Police Department. The red light blinked off, signaling the end of the segment. Ava exhaled slowly as the studio began moving again. Daniel approached her, pride in his eyes. You were incredible, he said, reaching for her hand. Ava smiled. I just told the truth. As they left the studio, they were met with a crowd of reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. But this time, Ava did not feel the same unease. She stood tall, her hand still resting in Daniel's. Martha Reed was waiting near the edge of the crowd, waving them over. You were brilliant, she said, as Ava and Daniel reached her. You spoke for so many who could not. Ava squeezed Martha's hand. I could not have done it without you. Martha smiled warmly. Oh, you would have found your strength. I just reminded you it was there. As they made their way to their car, Ava's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from a former patient she had operated on years ago. Thank you for speaking out. What happened to you should not happen to anyone. Ava's heart swelled. People are listening, she said aloud. Daniel gave her a knowing look. They are not just listening, they are inspired. By the time they reached home, the interview was already trending online. Clips of Ava's calm but powerful words had spread across social media, with hashtags calling for justice. But with the support came opposition. A new wave of posts surfaced, accusing Ava of overreacting or using her platform unfairly. The backlash was sharp, but Ava expected it. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Ava and Daniel sat on their front porch, letting the cool breeze wash over them. Ava's hands were still, her breathing even. Daniel broke the silence. "Do you think things will change?" Ava leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet but unwavering. "They already are. And we will keep fighting until it is more than a moment, it becomes a movement." Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The horizon ahead was full of unknowns, but one thing was certain: they had taken the first step towards something bigger than themselves. The next morning, the city of Havenbrook was buzzing with reactions to Ava's interview. Clips of her poised but passionate responses flooded social media and news outlets. Her words, "If I stay silent, I am complicit," had become a rallying cry. Some called her a hero for speaking out, while others accused her of inflaming tensions. Inside their home, the quiet hum of the coffee maker was the only sound as Ava and Daniel sat together at the kitchen table. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, but neither of them had taken a sip. Ava scrolled through the messages on her phone, a mixture of support and harsh criticism. Daniel broke the silence. "You do not have to read those comments." Ava looked up and gave him a small, tired smile. "I know, but for every hateful message, there are 5 more from people saying they finally feel seen." She held up her phone, showing him a message from a young woman. "Listen to this one. My brother was stopped last year for no reason. He was too scared to speak out. Thank you for giving people like us a voice." Daniel exhaled slowly. "It is still hard to see you being attacked." Ava reached across the table and took his hand. "I knew what I was stepping into, and I do not regret it." The doorbell rang, interrupting the quiet moment. Daniel rose and opened the door to find Sarah Whitman, one of the officers from Internal Affairs. She was dressed sharply, her expression serious but respectful. "Commissioner Mitchell," she greeted him. "May I come in?" Daniel nodded and stepped aside. "Of course." Sarah entered, her gaze briefly flickering toward Ava. "Dr. Mitchell, I watched your interview. It was powerful." Ava inclined her head. "Thank you." Sarah set a folder down on the table. "We have begun our formal investigation into Officers Turner and Lawson. There is a lot of pressure from the community and the department. Some are calling for swift action, but others, well, they are pushing back." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a breath. "There are officers who believe Turner and Lawson are being unfairly singled out. They see this as an attack on the entire department." Ava felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. How can they think that after what happened? Sarah's expression softened. "Change threatens people, Dr. Mitchell, especially those who are comfortable with the way things have always been." She paused. "But there are also officers who support what you are doing. They want to see reform as much as the community does. You have more allies than you think." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. "What is the next step?" Sarah opened the folder and slid a paper across the table. "There will be a formal hearing next week. Both officers will give testimony, and Dr. Mitchell will have the opportunity to share her account as well." Ava nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what was coming. "I will be there." Sarah stood, her gaze unwavering. "I believe you are doing the right thing, and I want you to know Internal Affairs is committed to a fair investigation." Daniel walked her to the door. "Thank you, Sarah." After she left, Ava and Daniel sat in silence for a moment. The reality of the upcoming hearing loomed over them, but Ava felt something else resolve. "I need to prepare," Ava said quietly. Daniel studied her, admiration flickering in his eyes. We will prepare together. Later that day, Ava went for a walk through Havenbrook Park, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft golden light on the path. She passed families pushing strollers and children playing near the swings, their laughter floating through the crisp air. She paused near a bench and sat down, staring at the pond where ducks drifted lazily. Her thoughts wandered to the hearing what she would say, how she would keep her composure when questioned. The weight of it all pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Mind if I join you?" Ava looked up and saw Martha Reed standing there with her ever-present walking cane. Ava smiled and scooted over. "Of course." Martha settled onto the bench with a soft sigh. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Ava nodded. "It is." Martha leaned forward, resting her hands on her cane. "You know, when I was a teacher, I had a student, bright kid, but shy. He never stood up for himself. One day, a classmate started teasing him, and before I could step in, another student, quiet as a mouse, stood up and told the bully to back off." Martha chuckled. "That shy boy found his voice that day, and it changed everything for him." Ava turned to Martha, sensing the meaning behind the story. "You think this hearing could be my moment to stand up not just for me, but for others?" Martha's eyes twinkled. "I know it is." Ava took a deep breath, letting Martha's words settle into her heart. "What if I get nervous? What if I freeze?" Martha patted Ava's hand. "You will not. You are stronger than you know. You stood your ground in front of those officers without anyone backing you up. This time, you have the whole city watching, and they are with you." Ava felt a warmth spread through her chest. She thought about the messages of support she had received, the people who had reached out to share their own stories. "You are right," Ava said softly. "This is bigger than me." Martha gave her a proud smile. "Exactly." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the ducks glide across the water. When Ava finally stood, she felt lighter, as though the weight she had been carrying had shifted into something else, something powerful. As Ava walked home, she passed a group of young women sitting on a nearby bench. One of them recognized her and gave a small wave. "Dr. Mitchell?" she called. Ava paused, surprised. "Yes?" The woman smiled nervously. "I saw your interview. Thank you for what you said." Ava's heart swelled with unexpected warmth. "Thank you for listening." The woman nodded, and Ava continued down the path, her steps steady and sure. By the time she reached home, Daniel was waiting for her on the porch. He raised an eyebrow as she climbed the steps. "Feeling better?" Ava nodded. "Yes, I think I am ready." Daniel reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "Then let's get to work." They walked inside together, side by side, ready for what was to come. The Havenbrook City Council chamber was packed. Rows of seats were filled with city officials, off-duty officers, reporters, and members of the community. The hum of whispers created a nervous undercurrent in the room as people waited for the proceedings to begin. The large wooden podiums at the front stood like silent sentinels, ready to bear witness to the truth. Ava sat beside Daniel at the front row of seats designated for witnesses, her heart steady, but her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Daniel's reassuring presence grounded her. His hand brushed against hers, a subtle but powerful reminder that he was there. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked quietly. Ava met his gaze and nodded. "I am." The room shifted as the council's moderator, a gray-haired man named Richard Price, tapped his gavel. "The hearing to review the actions of officers Brad Turner and Eric Lawson is now in session." His voice echoed through the chamber, calling the room to order. "We will hear testimony from all parties involved before determining our recommendations for disciplinary action." Ava felt the weight of every eye in the room as Richard continued. "First, We will hear from the officers in question. Officer Turner, you may approach the stand. Brad Turner rose from his seat. He was dressed in a crisp uniform, his posture rigid as he walked to the podium. Ava watched him carefully, trying to read his expression. There was no trace of the arrogance she had seen that day on the street, only a mixture of nerves and defiance. Brad cleared his throat. I understand the seriousness of this hearing, he began, his voice tight. But I want to make it clear that we believed we were following standard procedure. We received a report of suspicious activity, and Dr. Mitchell matched the description given to us. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ava felt her pulse quicken, but she remained silent. The moderator leaned forward. And did you have any additional information? Witnesses? Evidence? Brad hesitated. No, sir, but we acted based on the report. One of the council members, a middle-aged woman named Karen Lee, interjected. Officer Turner, are you aware that Dr. Mitchell was carrying a coffee and a small package at the time of the incident? What part of that seemed threatening? Brad shifted uncomfortably. It was not the items, it was her behavior. Her behavior? Karen's eyebrows rose. According to witness statements, she was calm and compliant. Brad's jaw tightened. She questioned the search. Karen leaned back, crossing her arms, as any innocent person would. The tension in the room thickened as Brad stumbled over his words, struggling to defend his actions. When he was finally dismissed from the stand, he walked back to his seat, looking deflated. The moderator's voice rang out again. We will now hear from Dr. Ava Mitchell. Daniel gave Ava an encouraging nod as she stood and made her way to the podium. The room fell into an expectant hush. Ava placed her hands on the wooden surface, feeling the grain beneath her fingers as she centered herself. Thank you for allowing me to speak, she began, her voice calm but unwavering. I am not here to seek revenge. I am here to speak the truth, not just for myself, but for anyone who has ever felt powerless and unheard. The room stilled, the air seeming to hold its breath. As Ava recounted every moment of that day, she described how she had been approached without cause, how the cuffs had been placed on her wrists as though she were a criminal. But what stayed with me, she said, her voice softening, was not just the humiliation. It was the realization that if it could happen to me, someone with resources, someone with a voice, it could happen to anyone. And it does, far too often. A few heads in the audience nodded, including Martha Reed, who sat near the back, her gaze steady and proud. Ava took a breath, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. I am not saying that all officers act this way. I know many who serve honorably, who put their lives on the line every day to protect this community. But trust between the people and those sworn to protect them is fragile. It is built on fairness and accountability, and when that trust is broken, it must be repaired not with excuses, but with action. A hush followed her words, thicker than before. Even the most skeptical council members seemed moved. Karen Lee leaned forward, her tone gentle. Dr. Mitchell, what do you hope to see as a result of this hearing? Ava's gaze swept across the room. I hope for reform. I hope for meaningful training and accountability measures so that no one else has to experience what I did. I believe in this city, and I believe in its capacity for change. The moderator nodded, his face thoughtful. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Your testimony is noted. As Ava returned to her seat, Daniel reached for her hand and gave it a supportive squeeze. She exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of calm after releasing the truth into the open. Next, Officer Eric Lawson took the stand. Unlike Brad, Eric looked visibly ashamed. He admitted that he had doubts during the incident, but had followed Turner's lead out of fear of causing tension. I should have spoken up, he confessed, and for that, I am sorry. Eric's admission sent a ripple through the room. It was rare to hear an officer admit fault so openly, and it caught everyone off guard. The hearing continued for another hour as legal representatives reviewed procedures and evidence. By the end, the moderator called for a recess before the council would deliberate. As people stood and stretched, Daniel and Ava remained seated. Martha made her way over, her smile warm and reassuring. "You spoke with such grace, Ava," Martha said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "No one who heard you today will forget it." Ava smiled. "Thank you, Martha. You gave me the courage to believe I could." Martha patted her arm. "You have always had it. I just reminded you." The three of them sat together quietly as the room began to settle again. When the moderator returned, the chamber stilled once more. After a brief preamble, Richard Price spoke the words that would determine the officers' futures. "After careful review of the testimony and evidence, the council has reached a decision." Richard Price's voice rang through the chamber, steady but heavy. "The council has determined that officers Brad Turner and Eric Lawson demonstrated a serious failure in judgment. Effective immediately, Officer Turner is relieved of duty pending further disciplinary action, and Officer Lawson will be suspended and required to undergo retraining and community service." The room was silent for a heartbeat before a wave of murmurs spread across the chamber. Some people whispered in approval, while others shook their heads, visibly dissatisfied. Ava felt her breath catch in her chest. It was not a perfect outcome, but it was a step toward accountability. Daniel's hand tightened gently around hers. She turned to him and saw the quiet pride in his eyes. As they stood to leave, reporters surged toward the front of the room. Microphones were thrust forward and cameras flashed. A reporter called out, "Dr. Mitchell, do you feel justice has been served?" Ava paused, taking a moment before responding. "This is a step forward," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "But accountability is not the end, it is the beginning. Real justice comes when we make lasting changes that prevent incidents like this from happening again." The reporters' questions overlapped, but Ava and Daniel made their way out, flanked by city officials. Martha was waiting near the entrance, her eyes bright with approval. "You handled that beautifully," she said, falling into step beside Ava. "Thank you," Ava replied, "but it is not over." Martha nodded. "It never is, but you have sparked something bigger than one hearing." Outside, a group of community members stood with signs reading, "Justice for all and no one is above the law." When Ava stepped outside, they erupted in applause. A young woman holding a sign approached her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Mitchell," she said. "You spoke for all of us." Ava smiled, touched by the sentiment. "We spoke together." Daniel led her to the car, but as they pulled away, Ava noticed the shadows forming on the horizon, the backlash she knew was coming. By the time they reached home, the story had already spread like wildfire across social media. Headlines popped up on their phones. "Officer fired after allegations of misconduct." "Police commissioner's wife pushes for change, but at what cost?" "Division in Havenbrook. Justice or overreach?" Ava sank onto the couch, scrolling through the flood of reactions. Comments of support were mixed with messages that stung. She just wanted attention. The police were doing their job. Why ruin careers over a misunderstanding? If she was not married to the commissioner, this would have been ignored. Ava placed her phone down, the sting of those words settling in her chest. She knew that change would not come without resistance, but it still hurt to see her intentions questioned. Daniel returned with 2 mugs of tea and set one in front of her. He sat beside her, watching her carefully. "Do not let them make you doubt yourself," he said gently. "You did the right thing." Ava wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I know, but I hate how quickly the truth gets twisted." Daniel nodded. "You have more people with you than against you. Do not forget that." Ava took a sip of tea and leaned back, letting the warmth fill her. She thought about the people who had approached her at the courthouse, the messages from strangers who finally felt seen. That was why she spoke out, not for the critics, but for those who felt invisible. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from one of the local news stations. The producer wanted to schedule a follow-up interview. Ava hesitated but answered. "We would love to have you speak on tomorrow's broadcast," the producer said. "The public wants to hear your perspective after the hearing." Ava agreed without hesitation. If people were still talking, then there was still an opportunity to push for change. The next day, Ava sat in the studio, the same place where she had told her story for the first time. The host greeted her warmly as the cameras rolled. "Dr. Mitchell, after yesterday's hearing, the community response has been divided. How do you feel about the outcome?" Ava took a steadying breath. "I believe the council made the right decision based on the facts, but this is not just about individual officers. It is about addressing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. That is what I am focused on." The host nodded. "What do you say to those who believe you are receiving special attention because of your husband's position?" Ava's gaze was calm, but unwavering. "I understand that concern, but this is not about who I am married to. This is about fairness and respect. If I stayed silent, what kind of example would I be setting? Change starts when someone speaks up, and I refuse to be silent." The room grew quiet as her words hung in the air. After the broadcast aired, Ava received an overwhelming wave of messages. Civil rights organizations reached out, inviting her to join forums and community events. Schools asked her to speak to students about standing up against injustice. But the backlash continued too. Some officers within the police department felt betrayed. Tensions brewed among factions, those who supported reform and those who resisted it. Daniel found himself at the center of it all. During a tense meeting at the department, one officer, a veteran named Greg Shaw, stood up. "This is tearing the department apart," he said. "We have worked hard to earn respect in this community, and now we are being painted as villains." Daniel remained calm. "We earn respect by holding ourselves accountable, Greg. If we hide behind a badge when we make mistakes, how can the community trust us?" The room fell silent. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical. After the meeting, Daniel returned home, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. Ava was sitting at the dining table, reviewing invitations for upcoming events. She looked up and saw the exhaustion in his eyes. She stood and wrapped her arms around him. "Long day?" Daniel nodded against her shoulder. "The longest." Ava pulled back and looked at him. "We knew this would be hard, but we are not alone in this." Daniel managed a small smile. "You are right." They sat together as the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the room. Outside, the city of Havenbrook moved on with its daily life. But beneath the surface, a shift was happening. People were talking not just about what had happened to Ava, but about the kind of community they wanted to build. Ava glanced at Daniel. "Do you think we will get there?" Daniel's hand found hers. "Yes," he said firmly. "One step at a time." The Havenbrook City Courthouse loomed large, its stone facade bathed in the golden morning sun. The building had become the center of attention, drawing crowds from across the city. Reporters gathered at the steps, cameras flashing as community members held signs reading "Justice for Ava" and "Accountability Now." Inside the courtroom, a tense silence settled over the crowd. Every seat was filled, with rows of reporters scribbling notes and spectators whispering. At the front, Ava and Daniel sat side by side, their lawyer reviewing notes one last time. Ava's hands rested calmly on her lap, but inside, a storm of nerves churned. This was not just about her anymore. This trial had become a symbol of something much larger. She glanced at Daniel, who gave her a small nod. She felt his quiet strength and knew that whatever happened today, she was not alone. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a composed demeanor, entered the room and took his seat. Court is now in session, he announced. Your Honor, began Karen Lewis, the prosecutor, a sharp-poised attorney known for her work in civil rights cases. She stepped forward, her voice clear. This case is not just about two officers. It is about the misuse of authority and the violation of human dignity. She turned to the jury. The prosecution will show that officers Brad Turner and Eric Lawson detained and humiliated Dr. Ava Mitchell without probable cause, failing to uphold the very oath they swore to honor. Karen's confidence filled the room as she called her first witness, a young man who had recorded the incident. The courtroom watched as the video played on a large screen, the grainy footage capturing the moment Brad cuffed Ava's wrists and Martha Reed stepped forward to defend her. The room was silent, except for the quiet murmurs as the scene unfolded. Karen turned back to the jury. Look at her face, she said, pointing to the frame where Ava stood in disbelief. Does this look like the face of someone who posed a threat? Or does it look like someone being treated unfairly in front of the entire world? The defense attorney, a serious man in a gray suit named Martin Hall, stood and addressed the judge. Objection. Emotional argument. The judge nodded. Sustained. Ms. Lewis, stay focused on the facts. Karen smiled politely. Of course, Your Honor. Next, Brad Turner was called to the stand. He walked stiffly to the front, his uniform neatly pressed, but his expression guarded. Martin stepped forward. Officer Turner, can you explain your actions that day? Brad folded his hands. We received a report of suspicious activity involving a woman near the cafe. When we arrived, Dr. Mitchell matched the description. Martin nodded. And did she resist? No, but she questioned us, Brad replied, glancing briefly at Ava. And that made you suspicious? Martin asked. Brad hesitated. We have to be cautious in our line of work. Sometimes questions are signs of evasion. Karen's voice cut through the room. Or signs of knowing one's rights. The judge motioned for Karen to wait her turn, but the damage was done. The jury had heard her point. When it was Ava's turn to take the stand, she rose slowly, aware of how many eyes were on her. She took her seat, her back straight, hands folded in front of her. Karen approached with a gentle expression. Dr. Mitchell, can you tell the court what you remember from that day? Ava nodded, her voice calm but clear. I remember leaving the cafe after a long shift. I was tired, but content. I had bought a coffee and a small gift for a colleague. I was steps away from my car when I was approached by two officers. I was confused but polite. I answered their questions, but when I asked why I was being stopped, things escalated. Karen stepped closer. How did you feel when the handcuffs were placed on your wrists? Ava hesitated, the memory pressing against her like a cold weight. Humiliated, she said softly. Afraid, and above all, powerless. She paused. I have spent my life helping people in their most vulnerable moments, but that day, I became the one who felt helpless. A ripple of emotion spread through the room. Some spectators wiped at their eyes. Even the judge shifted in his seat. Martin stood and approached for cross-examination. Dr. Mitchell, you said you felt afraid, but isn't it true that you knew your husband was the police commissioner? Did you not feel secure knowing you could call him? Ava met Martin's gaze evenly. Knowing I could call for help did not change the fact that I was treated like a suspect for no reason. It did not change the humiliation I felt in that moment, or the fact that if I had not spoken out, nothing would have happened to those officers. Martin pressed his lips together, realizing his line of questioning was backfiring. No further questions, he muttered. Ava stepped down, feeling the weight lift slightly from her chest. As she returned to her seat, Daniel took her hand and squeezed it. The closing statements began, with Karen delivering a powerful message about accountability and fairness. We are not here to tear down law enforcement, she said. We are here to ensure that those who wear the badge do so with honor and integrity. Because without accountability, there is no trust. And without trust, there is no justice. Martin's defense was clinical, focusing on policy and arguing that the officers were following procedure, but even as he spoke, it was clear that the room was not convinced. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom thick as everyone waited for the verdict. Ava and Daniel sat side by side, their hearts heavy with anticipation. Finally, the jury filed back in. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with glasses, stood and faced the judge. On the charges of misconduct and unlawful detention, we find the defendants guilty. A collective exhale filled the room, followed by quiet applause. The judge's gavel brought the room back to silence as he announced the officers' sentencing dismissal from the force and mandatory community service. Ava felt a wave of relief and emotion rise in her chest. She turned to Daniel, her eyes glistening. "It is over," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "No," he said gently, "this is just the beginning." As they exited the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters clamored for statements, but Ava and Daniel stayed focused, walking hand in hand. When a journalist asked, "Dr. Mitchell, what do you want people to remember about today?" Ava paused, turning toward the cameras. "That justice is possible," she said, "but it takes all of us standing together." The crowd applauded, and Ava felt the weight of their support. She knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, hope felt within reach. The courthouse steps were alive with movement, cameras flashed, voices rose, and the crowd pressed forward as Ava and Daniel made their way down, hands still clasped tightly together. Supporters cheered, their voices blending into a steady chant of "Justice for all! Justice for all!" Martha Reed stood near the bottom of the stairs, her eyes shining with pride as she waved them over. Ava's heart lifted when she saw her. She had been there from the beginning, a small but mighty force of kindness in a moment of darkness. "You did it," Martha said as she embraced Ava tightly. "You stood tall, and the whole city saw you." Ava smiled, a mixture of exhaustion and relief settling over her. "We did it," she corrected. "I never could have done this alone." Daniel nodded. "This is about more than a single case, it is about what happens next." The crowd thinned as the reporters began packing up their equipment, already rushing to broadcast the verdict across every network. The courthouse's grand doors closed behind the last few stragglers, leaving the scene outside quieter, but still charged with energy. Martha pulled Ava aside gently. "Come to the park tomorrow," she said. "There is going to be a community gathering, a peaceful one. People want to hear from you." Ava hesitated, feeling the weight of the last few days pressing down on her. "I do not know if I have anything left to give, Martha." Martha's gaze softened. "You have more in you than you think, dear. Sometimes the fight continues not because we choose it, but because others need to see us keep going." Ava met her eyes, realizing how true the words were. "All right," she said quietly. "I will be there." That evening, the house was unusually still. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock filled the space. Ava and Daniel sat on the couch, sharing the quiet between them. For the first time in days, they had nothing urgent to prepare for, no press calls to return, no interviews scheduled. Daniel's arm rested around Ava's shoulders as she leaned into him. The dim light from the lamp cast a warm glow around them. "Do you feel it?" Daniel asked after a long silence. "Feel what?" Ava replied, her voice soft. "The shift," he said. "The moment when something cracks and starts to change." Ava thought about the courtroom, the people who had stood and clapped when the verdict was read. She thought about the faces in the crowd, some relieved, some tearful, and some inspired. "I think I do," she murmured. Daniel kissed her temple gently. "You are the reason for that shift." Ava shook her head. "No, we are the reason, and Martha, and everyone who stood up." Daniel nodded, but didn't argue. He knew Ava's humility was part of what made her strong, but in his eyes, she was a beacon that others had followed. The next day, the weather was unseasonably warm. The sky was a bright, endless blue as Ava and Daniel walked toward Havenbrook Park. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the air. A small stage had been set up near the pond, and a crowd was already gathered: families, students, local leaders, and friends. Children ran across the grass, their laughter weaving through the hum of conversation. Ava felt a flutter of nervousness. "I was not expecting this many people," she whispered to Daniel. He smiled. "That is because you underestimate the difference you have made." Martha waved them over from the front row, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. "There you are," she said cheerfully. "The people have been waiting for you." Ava felt her pulse quicken as she approached the small microphone set up on the stage. The crowd quieted as she stepped up, the weight of their anticipation palpable. She took a deep breath and began. "I never imagined that my life would take me here. I am a surgeon, not a speaker. But life has a way of asking us to step outside of what we know." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I did not speak out to become a symbol," Ava continued, her voice gaining strength. "I spoke out because no one should ever be treated as less than human. No one should ever have to wonder if their dignity will be respected. And as much as I wish this story was unique, it is not." She paused, letting the truth of her words settle. "We are not here to tear anyone down. We are here to rebuild something better. Real change is not about punishment. It is about accountability. It is about trust. And that kind of change takes all of us." Ava's gaze swept across the crowd, her heart swelling as she saw so many different faces, young and old, hopeful and determined. "This is not the end of something," she concluded. "It is the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, some people rising to their feet. Ava stepped back, overwhelmed by the wave of support. Martha beamed at her, clapping with the rest of them. Daniel joined Ava on stage, taking her hand as they faced the crowd together. The applause softened into conversations and laughter as the event became less about speeches and more about connection. Ava stepped down, weaving through the crowd as people approached her to thank her. A young man with a shy smile stopped her. "My dad. He was stopped like you were last year. He was too afraid to report it. But after seeing what you did, he is finally speaking out." Ava felt a lump rise in her throat. "That means everything," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. The young man nodded and stepped away, leaving Ava with a deep sense of purpose. As the sun began to set, Daniel and Ava walked to their usual bench near the pond, where the ducks drifted lazily across the water. The warm, orange light reflected on the surface, casting long shadows across the grass. Ava rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. "Do you think it will get easier?" Daniel's arm wrapped around her. "Not right away," he said honestly, "but I believe it will get better." Ava closed her eyes, letting herself believe it too. "Martha was right," she whispered. "Kindness matters. It changes everything." Daniel smiled and kissed her forehead. "And so do you." The sounds of the park faded as the city settled into the twilight. Ava felt the weight of the past lift slightly as a quiet hope blossomed in its place. The journey had not ended, but they had reached a new beginning. The morning air in Havenbrook was cool and fresh as sunlight spilled through the windows of Ava and Daniel's home. The city felt different, as though it was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Ava stood by the window, holding her coffee mug and watching the quiet street below. The world felt peaceful in that moment, but Ava knew that change was never fully quiet. It moved in ripples, spreading farther than you ever expected. Daniel entered the room, a soft smile tugging at his face. He leaned in and kissed her cheek. "You are up early," he said. Ava smiled as she sipped her coffee. "Could not sleep. Too much on my mind." Daniel nodded. Today is a big day. Today marked the official launch of the Havenbrook Justice Initiative, a project born from Ava's experience and Daniel's unwavering determination to reform the system from within. The initiative would provide legal support for individuals who had been mistreated by authorities, offer training programs for officers, and create community events aimed at fostering trust. The work had not come easily. Ava thought of the long meetings, the sleepless nights, and the moments of doubt. But now, standing at the cusp of something new, she felt a deep sense of pride, not just for herself, but for the entire community. "You ready for this?" Daniel asked, as he grabbed his coat. Ava turned to face him. More than ever. The park was buzzing with energy as the community gathered once again. Colorful banners that read, "A Stronger Havenbrook," swayed gently in the breeze. There were food trucks, kids running around with balloons, and a small stage set up for speakers. It felt more like a celebration than an official event, which was exactly what Ava had hoped for. Martha Reed was already there, sitting comfortably near the front, with her usual air of quiet confidence. She waved to Ava and Daniel as they arrived. Martha grinned as Ava approached. "You keep giving speeches. People are going to start calling you a leader, you know." Ava laughed softly. "I am not sure I like the sound of that." Martha gave her a knowing look. "You do not have to like it. It is already true." The first speaker took the stage, a young woman who had reached out to Ava after the trial. She was small in stature, but spoke with a strength that filled the space. She shared her story of being stopped unjustly and how Ava's courage had inspired her to file a formal complaint. The crowd listened intently, some nodding, some wiping away quiet tears. Ava felt her heart swell as she watched. This was why she had spoken out. This was what it meant to create change, not in one grand moment, but in the quiet courage of others who found their voice. After the speeches, Ava wandered through the crowd, greeting people and thanking them for coming. She was stopped by a group of officers who had attended in uniform. One of them, a young officer named Marcus Evans, approached her nervously. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice steady but cautious, "I just wanted to say thank you for not giving up on us." Ava's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Marcus shifted slightly. "There are a lot of us who joined the force to help people, to do the right thing. But the system, it makes you feel like you have to stay quiet, like speaking up makes you a traitor." He took a breath. "But you showed us that accountability does not make us weaker, it makes us better." Ava felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you, Officer Evans. What you said means more than you know." He smiled and walked away, blending back into the crowd. Ava stood still for a moment, absorbing the quiet power of his words. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Ava and Daniel found themselves back at their favorite bench, near the pond. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The ducks floated lazily across the water, undisturbed by the bustle behind them. Ava took a deep breath and let the quiet fill her. She leaned against Daniel, closing her eyes for a moment. "It feels like the first time I have really slowed down," she said. Daniel chuckled. "You have been running at full speed for months." "I had to," Ava replied, "but it is nice to sit still and breathe again." Daniel turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when this all started, I was terrified for you, for us, but you stood up with so much strength. You showed this city what resilience looks like." Ava smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I only stood up because of the people who stood beside me." Daniel wrapped his arm around her, his voice quiet but firm. "You changed lives, Ava. And you reminded people, including me, that kindness and courage can move mountains." The park grew quieter as people packed up and began to head home. A few children lingered, chasing each other near the water's edge, their laughter carrying through the air. Ava watched them and felt a deep sense of peace. "Do you think the city will stay on this path?" she asked softly. Daniel's eyes followed hers. It will not be perfect. There will still be setbacks. But what we have started, it will grow. People will remember today, and they will remember you. Ava rested her head against his shoulder. I do not care if they remember me, she whispered. I just want them to remember that things can get better if we do not give up. Daniel kissed the top of her head, his voice filled with quiet certainty. They will. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over Havenbrook as streetlights began to flicker on. The city felt lighter somehow, more connected, more hopeful. Ava closed her eyes, letting the sounds of life continue around her. She knew there was still work to do. There would always be more work to do. But for now, she allowed herself to simply be, to rest, to reflect, and to feel the quiet hum of hope coursing through her. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Daniel's voice broke the silence. Ready to head home? Ava opened her eyes and nodded. Yes, but I think this time we will take the long way. Daniel smiled, standing and helping her to her feet. Together, they walked along the winding path that led out of the park, their hands intertwined. The air was cool, the sky vast, and their hearts full of something far greater than fear, something unbreakable. As they made their way home, the sounds of Havenbrook drifted behind them, a city still healing, still growing, but stronger and more united than ever. The journey was far from over, but Ava and Daniel knew this. Kindness, resilience, and hope had taken root, and from that foundation, something beautiful would continue to grow. Ava and Daniel's story reminds us that resilience, kindness, and the courage to stand up for what is right can spark change far beyond what we can see. In the face of adversity, their unwavering belief in justice proved that even the smallest voices, when united, can become a powerful force for good. But their story is not just about one moment. It is a reminder that change is possible when people come together, when empathy triumphs over fear, and when hope is stronger than doubt. What will you stand for today? How will you choose to use your voice to make a difference? Thank you for being part of this journey. If Ava and Daniel's story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you that justice and hope still matter, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue to share stories of resilience, kindness, and courage. Let's keep building a better tomorrow together. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.